The Basque language, Euskara, stands alone in Europe, a linguistic orphan with no known living relatives, its roots utterly opaque to the comparative method that mapped every other tongue on the continent. For centuries, that isolation was taken as a sign of something far deeper, the belief that the Basques themselves were a relic population, the direct descendants of Europe's first modern humans, uncontaminated by the tides of migration that washed over the rest of the continent. It was a story that placed them outside history, a living fossil of the Ice Age. But when geneticists finally unlocked the full story written in Basque DNA, in ancient bones and in the blood of living villagers, the narrative did not simply shatter, it inverted. The Basques were not the purest survivors of the Paleolithic. They were something far stranger, and far more revealing, about how Europe was really made. This is the genetic history of the Basque people. The landscape itself offers the first clue. The Basque country arcs around the western end of the Pyrenees, a crumpled wall of limestone peaks that divide the Iberian Peninsula from the rest of Europe, its northern flank dissolving into the storm-gray Bay of Biscay. During the last glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago, when ice sheets smothered Britain and Scandinavia, and tundra gripped the interior, this narrow strip of coastal lowland and sheltered valley became one of the continent's crucial refugia, a place where plants, animals, and human beings could endure the deep freeze. While northern Europe emptied, small bands of hunter-gatherers persisted here, hunting ibex and red deer, fishing for salmon in the rivers, and leaving behind a record of their presence in the caves that pock the limestone. The most famous of these is Altamira, just west of the modern Basque heartland, where bison painted in charcoal and ochre charge across a ceiling that has been called the Sistine Chapel of the Paleolithic. Those artists belong to the Magdalenian culture, which flourished in the region between 17 and 12,000 years ago, as the ice began its slow retreat. Their toolkit, delicate bone harpoons, engraved antler, flint blades, spread across the Franco-Cantabrian region, and their genetic legacy, as modern research would later show, forms a deep but far from exclusive layer in the Basque gene pool. As the climate warmed and forests marched back across the continent, the descendants of these Ice Age survivors adapted to a world in flux. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who roamed the Basque Hills 8,000 years ago were not isolated. Recent ancient DNA from sites like Aizpea and Achosti shows they shared broad genetic affinities with other Western European foragers, carrying the Y chromosome haplogroup 1 and mitochondrial lineages like U5b, signatures of the old hunter-gatherer populations that had repopulated the continent from the south. They were part of a wider world, not a sealed enclave, and that world was about to be transformed by a revolution that originated far to the east. Around 6,200 years ago, the first Neolithic farmers began arriving on the Iberian Peninsula, moving along the Mediterranean coast and up the Ebro Valley. They brought with them domesticated wheat and barley, sheep and goats, polished stone axes, and the knowledge of pottery. They also carried a genetic signature that was overwhelmingly distinct from the hunter-gatherers they encountered, ancestry from early Anatolian farmers who had spread across Europe over the preceding 3 millennia, mixing only occasionally with the foragers in their path. When these pioneer farmers reached the Basque country, the archaeological record shows a swift and thorough transformation. Open-air settlements like Haricobara and Marazulo appeared, with storage pits, sickle blades, and the bones of domestic animals. The cave burials of this period yield skeletons whose strontium isotopes indicate a diet built on cereals, not wild game. The transition was profound, and yet, something in the Basque region resisted complete replacement. When geneticists later sequenced the genomes of early Iberian farmers, individuals from sites like El Portalón in the Atapuerca Hills, just south of the Basque country, and from the Cave of Chaves in the Pyrenean foothills, they found a pattern. These first farmers had indeed mixed with local hunter-gatherers, but the proportion of forager ancestry in the Basque area was significantly higher than in other parts of Iberia, reaching as much as 20 to 25% in some individuals. The local hunter-gatherer males, it seems, were not wholly displaced. Their lineages persisted alongside the newcomers, and their daughters were taken into farming communities. A fusion was underway, one that would set the stage for a deeper divergence. That divergence accelerated in the Bronze Age, a period that reshaped the genetic map of Europe with a force that had long been underestimated. Between 4,500 and 3,500 years ago, a massive migration from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the so-called Yamnaya expansion, swept westward, carrying Indo-European languages, the wheel, and a new social order built on pastoralism and hierarchical chiefdoms. Across most of Europe, this migration replaced large portions of the existing gene pool. In Britain, for example, it virtually erased the Neolithic population. In Iberia, the impact was substantial but not total. And in the Basque country, something extraordinary happened. The steppe signal, so prominent almost everywhere else, arrived in a muted form. When researchers at the University of Uppsala, led by Torsten Günther, analyzed 8 individuals from the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age site of El Portalón in 2015, they found that these early Basques, dated to between 3,900 and 3,500 years ago, were already genetically distinct from other Iberian populations. They carried the typical mix of Anatolian farmer and local hunter-gatherer ancestry, but they lacked the steppe component that was pouring into the surrounding regions. They were, in effect, a pocket of the earlier Neolithic world, persisting unchanged as the Bronze Age roared past them. The reason for this insulation likely lies in geography. The steep, narrow valleys of the Pyrenean foothills offered little attraction for the steppe pastoralists, whose economy relied on open grasslands for their herds. So they bypassed the rugged uplands, and the people who already lived there remained, speaking a language that was not Indo-European, a language that may well have descended directly from the tongue of those first Neolithic farmers, or even earlier hunter-gatherers. This is the moment when the Basque genetic and linguistic singularity began to crystallize. The Iron Age brought the next great test, and it came not from anonymous migrants but from the most powerful empire the Mediterranean had ever seen. The Romans arrived in the Iberian Peninsula in 218 BCE, during the Second Punic War, and spent the next 2 centuries methodically conquering every tribe from the Pillars of Hercules to the Pyrenees. They encountered the people they called the Vascones in the region that now bears their name, and the encounter was characteristically brutal. Roman sources, Strabo, Pliny the Elder, Ptolemy, describe a scattered collection of hill forts and small agricultural communities, fiercely independent and difficult to subdue. The Romans never fully conquered the Basque highlands as they did the rest of Hispania. They built roads and a few garrison towns, most notably Pompeiello, which would become modern Pamplona, but the rugged interior remained largely autonomous. The Vascones paid tribute, contributed auxiliary troops to the legions, and otherwise were left to themselves. This partial integration had profound consequences. While the rest of the Iberian Peninsula underwent thorough Romanization, adopting Latin, urban life, and eventually Christianity in its Roman form, the Basque valleys retained their ancestral tongue and much of their social structure. Latin loanwords seeped into Euskara, but the language itself did not yield. And genetically, the pattern of isolation continued. Recent analysis of Iron Age genomes from the Basque region, published in 2019 by a team led by André Flores Bello, shows that by the Roman period, the Basques were already forming a distinct genetic cluster, separated from their Celtiberian neighbors to the south and Aquitanians to the north. The Roman Empire, for all its assimilative power, had inadvertently preserved a human enclave. That enclave persisted through the collapse of Rome, the Visigothic invasions, and the Muslim conquest of Iberia in the 8th century. The Basque territories were never fully incorporated into the Umayyad Caliphate. The Franks, too, found them intractable, as Charlemagne learned painfully at the Battle of Roncevaux Pass in 778, when a Basque force ambushed and destroyed his rearguard, an event immortalized with considerable poetic license in the Song of Roland. In the medieval period, the Basques forged a series of small polities: the Kingdom of Navarre, the Lordship of Biscay, the Province of Guipúzcoa, that fiercely guarded their customary laws, known as the fueros. They became renowned as shipbuilders and whalers, venturing as far as Newfoundland long before Columbus. A Basque whaling station at Red Bay, Labrador, has been dated to the early 16th century. Their language, meanwhile, remained a stubborn anomaly, noted with curiosity by travelers and scholars. Yet none of this history, rich as it is, prepared the world for the obsession with Basque blood that would erupt in the 19th and 20th centuries, and that would set the stage for the genetic revelation to come. The first scientific indication that the Basques were biologically unusual came not from DNA but from blood types. In the early 20th century, as the ABO blood group system became widely used, researchers noticed a striking pattern. The Basques had the highest frequency of blood type O in Europe, approaching 60% in some valleys, and among the lowest frequencies of type B. Even more startling, they exhibited an exceptionally high rate of Rh-negative blood, around 30 to 35%, compared to a European average of 16% and a global average of less than 10. This combination was so distinctive that it fueled an entire theory of Basque origins. Physical anthropologists and nationalist ideologues alike seized on the data, arguing that the Basques represented a pure Paleolithic stock, descended from Cro-Magnon man, isolated in their mountain fastness since the Ice Age. Sabino Arana, the founder of modern Basque nationalism, had already laid the ideological groundwork in the 1890s, with his racialist doctrine that exalted Basque blood as the foundation of the nation. The blood group findings seemed to provide scientific vindication. This myth of Paleolithic purity took deep root, not only in Basque identity but in the wider European imagination. The Basques became the original Europeans, the living ancestors. Yet that narrative, for all its emotional power, rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of how blood group frequencies work. Genetic drift, the random fluctuation of gene variants in a small, isolated population, can produce extreme frequencies without any necessary link to deep ancestry. A bottleneck, a founder effect, or simply prolonged endogamy could all inflate O and Rh-negative rates. The blood groups were a clue, not a confirmation. And as the tools of molecular genetics advanced in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the true story began to emerge from the DNA itself. The first systematic studies of Basque genetics using mitochondrial DNA passed down the maternal line and Y chromosome markers passed down the paternal line complicated the purity picture. Mitochondrial lineages in the Basque population were overwhelmingly European and ancient, predominantly haplogroup H, V, and U5b. But they were not unique. They were shared with other Western European populations, particularly those of the Atlantic fringe. The Y chromosome, however, told a more dramatic story. In the early 2000s, researchers found that the Basques carried an extraordinarily high frequency of a specific Y chromosome lineage, R1b-DF27, at rates exceeding 80% in some areas. This was a problem for the Paleolithic purity hypothesis, because R1b is now known to have spread across Western Europe with the Bronze Age steppe migrations. Its dominance in Basque men suggested either that the steppe migrants had indeed arrived in the region, or that R1b had been present in the Paleolithic, a possibility that ancient DNA would soon decisively reject. Other paternal lineages, such as the Paleolithic 1-2a, were present but at low frequencies. The Basques were not pure Paleolithic males. They were overwhelmingly carriers of a Bronze Age marker. Yet they lacked the steppe autosomal ancestry that accompanied that marker elsewhere. This paradox would only be resolved when whole genomes came under scrutiny. The turning point arrived in 2015, with the publication of the first genome-wide ancient DNA study to include Basque remains. The team led by Torsten Günther sequenced the genomes of 8 individuals from the El Portalón cave, spanning the Copper and Bronze Ages. The results were unambiguous. These early Basques, clustered with other Iberian and southern French populations of the early Neolithic, carrying a mix of Anatolian farmer and Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. They did not show the steppe signal that was already appearing in central Iberia by the Bronze Age. Crucially, they also showed a striking continuity with modern Basques, who had inherited their farmer-hunter-gatherer blend with only minor later admixture. The Basques had not been sealed off since the Ice Age. They had been sealed off since the Bronze Age. The difference was epochal. The study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, effectively ended the Paleolithic purity model. But it raised a new question. If the Basques were simply a relict Neolithic population, why did they speak a non-Indo-European language? The answer, Günther and others suggested, was that the language of the Neolithic farmers, perhaps a form of early Vasconic, had survived in the Pyrenean refuge while the rest of Europe shifted to Indo-European tongues brought by the steppe pastoralists. The Basques were not the original Europeans. They were the last speakers of a lost linguistic world. Subsequent research has deepened and refined this picture. In 2019, a comprehensive study led by André Flores Bello and David Comas analyzed the genomes of over 1,000 modern individuals from across the Basque Country and surrounding regions, comparing them with ancient DNA from Iberia. Published in Current Biology, the study revealed that the Basques form a distinct genetic cluster within the European landscape, but one that is most closely related to other Iberian populations, particularly those of the Pyrenean region. The differentiation, the team argued, occurred largely in the Iron Age, after the steppe migration had already reshaped the rest of the peninsula. A later influx of Roman-era ancestry, so visible in other Iberians, barely touched the Basques. They became an island, not of the Paleolithic, but of the Iron Age. The study also demonstrated that the high frequency of Rh-negative blood is indeed a product of genetic drift and natural selection, possibly linked to resistance to certain pathogens or to the pressures of a pastoralist diet, not a badge of immaculate descent. One of the most evocative findings came from a 2021 study that analyzed the genomes of Basque-speaking populations in France and Spain, uncovering subtle but significant substructure. The Basques of the French side, in the province of Sol, Labourd, and Lower Navarre, showed a slightly different genetic profile from their Spanish counterparts, reflecting a history of separate demographic trajectories since the medieval period. Yet both groups shared a core of ancestry that traced back to those Bronze Age holdouts. The DNA even carried echoes of the medieval fueros and the endogamous valley communities that kept to themselves for centuries, marrying within a radius of a few kilometers. A pattern that further amplified the drift-driven distinctiveness of Basque blood, making it appear more exotic than its origins warranted. The ancient DNA revolution did not merely debunk a myth. It rewrote the Basque story as a parable of resilience through isolation. The Basques were not a people frozen in time. They were a people who, by a combination of geography and historical accident, retained a deep layer of Europe's Neolithic heritage, while the world around them changed utterly. Their language, Euskara, is not a fossil of the Stone Age, but a survivor of the Bronze Age upheaval, a linguistic Galapagos in the Pyrenean uplands. Their genes carry the traces of all the major prehistoric migrations, the hunter-gatherers, the farmers, even a whisper of the steppe, but in proportions and combinations that exist nowhere else. They are unique, not because they are pure, but because they are a particular mix that then went its own way. In the end, the DNA of the Basque people answers the question that haunted European prehistory for a century. They are not the untouched descendants of the cave painters, but neither are they simply another Iberian population. They are the outcome of a long process of fusion and seclusion, a process that began when the first farmers climbed into the Pyrenean valleys, continued through the Bronze Age when the steppe riders passed them by, and hardened in the Iron Age when the Roman eagles could not fully enclose them. Their blood type O and their Rh-negative factor are not emblems of purity but signatures of survival in small, in-marrying communities. The final lesson of Basque genetics is that isolation, not antiquity, is the true sculptor of human difference. And that, perhaps, is the more remarkable story. Not one of a people unchanged since the dawn, but of a people who, by staying apart, became something entirely their own.